and welcome to the Questioning Behaviour podcast. Again, we are here, your hosts. My name is Sarah Bowen and my good friend Merle van den Akker is here.
You're getting better and better at pronouncing that, Sarah.
You're the dummy that don't believe in science. All your projects always be denying.
After this podcast reaches a 50 episode, I'm sure you'll be able to say it flawlessly.
Oh my god, that is such the highest compliment. I have been working on it. I swear to you, I will get there eventually, even if it is the 50th episode. We're working towards it. Yeah, that's just cheered me right up, that has. I feel super good about that now. So today, guys, we are going to be bringing you another episode where the theme is, of course, behavioral science. And today we're going to be talking about human risk and compliance. Now, Mela, when I say compliance to you, what am I talking about?
I have to admit that, so we record these bookends before, after we have had the conversation, so we can sort of steer ourselves, right? So we
don't reveal our secrets.
I have a feeling we've revealed this in a previous episode, multiple previous episodes. So we've already had the conversation about, you know, what it is and how behavioral science can be properly applied to it. Now, I have to be very honest that before that conversation, I was quite clueless. To me, compliance just means following the rules, and that was about as much as I had. How about you?
I think that's a pretty good start. I mean, my research for the past 3 years has been about adherence, which is in some way, it used to be called compliance, but they did a bit of a rebranding on that, right?
Oh, those rebranders.
Yeah. So it's a more, I guess, patients and medical professionals have equal responsibility in the behaviour rather than it just being on the patient. So sure. Compliance to me suggests there's sort of a power imbalance, that someone is asking you to comply with something, and it's up to the individual who's been asked to comply, or that their behaviour, how much do they adhere or comply to the rules or systems in place. And I could be completely wrong, and Christian, I'm so sorry if I am. But there we go. I mean, it's an interesting question, I guess, super relevant for the times that we're recording in, where everyone, I guess, is
non-compliant. Everyone is non-compliant. We have fucked this up.
Yeah, and at least people are sort of more aware of their behaviour and, is this in line or consistent with the new regulations and things like that? So people are thinking about it, but maybe that doesn't lead to more compliance. Who knows?
Yeah, who knows? By this stage, I feel like we don't have the insights. Very clearly, we do not. This is not a field that, I mean, Sarah knows more about than I do. I feel like a complete noob. So with that lovely description of my own knowledge, I feel like it's a good idea to introduce our guest. I mean, Sarah has already mentioned, but today we are going to be talking to Christian Hunt, who will hopefully, so normally we have a conversation, but I feel by this stage, hopefully he will give us an education about compliance.
Yes. And we continue the tradition of having experienced podcasters as guests onto the podcast.
Which makes us look so good.
Oh, yeah. They do a great job. Great guests.
Yes.
Well, without further ado, let's stop listening to us talking about stuff we know nothing about, and let's talk to someone who knows a bit more. So, Christian.
Here we go.
Here we go.
So today we are talking to Christian Hunt. So then my question, as always, Christian, who are you? Introduce yourself to the audience, please.
What a great question. So I'm Christian Hunt. I am the founder of Human Risk, which is a company that specializes in bringing behavioral science to ethics and compliance. And I'll put that in really simple terms as to what that means, because I know many of your listeners will look at the word compliance and their eyes will understandably glaze over. But basically, my background is in financial services. And I kind of out of university, I qualified as an accountant. We try not to talk about that. And then I moved into banking, to be honest, because it was well paid and sounded interesting. And then through complete sets of accident, I ended up doing quite a lot of roles that involved looking at the regulatory side of banking. Because banking, as you know, is a heavily regulated industry for very good reasons. Mm-hmm. And fast forward through a few roles, I find myself after the crisis, and I always have to stress this, at the regulator, because they were looking for people at the regulator who weren't natural regulators to try and control the banks. And we saw what happened during the financial crisis. Things got a little bit out of hand, and clearly it was the banks were doing things they shouldn't have done, but equally the regulator hadn't responded in the right way. And so they were looking for people that weren't natural regulators who kind of brought something a bit different. So I found myself doing regulation, supervising banks. That's the bit of the regulator that faces off against the banks to kind of keep an eye on what they're up to. And I moved from there, and I spent most of my time as a regulator looking at one particular firm, which was UBS. The Swiss bank. And
I'm sure UBS was thrilled to have you just panting down the back of their neck.
Well, so the interesting thing was I became a regulator, and 7 days after I'd taken the role, I had this portfolio of international firms to look at. And you kind of go, where the hell do I start with these massive beasts? And 7 days after I started, there was a rogue trader at UBS who cost the firm quite a lot of money, and could, if he'd continued doing, we'd taken the firm down. And that was in London. So I was the sort of the head of that regulatory piece in London. And so I spent most of my time looking at the aftermath of that and dealing with a whole load of other issues. And if a regulator's looking at you, it's never a good thing, because they're not looking for you because you're committing best practice. It tends to be because something's gone wrong. And so I spent most of my time as a regulator looking at them with other international firms, but they were my main focus. I then became COO at the regulator, which was then part of the Bank of England, which was kind of interesting experience. Realized I didn't want to be a central banker. And then the logical place for me to go was UBS, because I knew them really well. And for some reason that doesn't necessarily make sense, but in the UK, you can flip between the industry and the regulator. So there's some sense to it in that you get knowledge on both sides, but you could see the potential conflict. But anyway, I joined UBS in risk and compliance, which is really about the compliance pieces are really about making sure the firm complies with the rules and does what it needs to do to be, to basically be allowed to continue to do its business. And the second part of my role was operational risk, which is looking at all of the risks of the business that aren't financial. So not thinking about kind of lending losses or exposure to markets, but looking at things like cyber, fraud, reputational risk, just sort of operational errors. So all of the non-financial risks. And what I realized as I was doing that role, and I was really eating my own regulatory cooking, because I'd set a lot of the requirements the firm had to comply with when I'd been on the other side of the fence. And as I was doing this role, what I realized was that compliance was the business of influencing human decision-making, because you can't just say to an organization, be compliant, because inanimate objects tend not to react well to being told what to do. So what you're doing there is you need the people within the organization to do the right thing. And so if you get all the people in the organization to do the right thing, the organization magically becomes compliant. So that was one side of what I was doing. The second side, when you look at operational risk, the largest single cause of operational risk within the firm was people either causing problems in the first place or making them worse by the way they reacted to them. And so suddenly I had this revelatory moment, because I just went, oh my God, I'm in the business of influencing human decision-making, and we're going about it a really bad way. And that's not a criticism of that firm. The whole industry looks at it this way. And I just suddenly went, this is awful. And the reason I knew it was awful was, one, I'd been at the regulator, so I knew what the regulator wanted. But two, I was kind of suffering at the end of it, because when you're in compliance, you have to set the example. So you have to do what you have to follow the rules. You have to go on all the training courses. You're caught by the most stringent rules. And it was all being done in my name, because emails were going out in my name, policies were going out in my name. And I'd have people come up to me and go, what the hell is this? And I'm like, I don't know. I can't really justify it. So I got to a point where it became so frustrating for me that I was like, I've got to do something about this. This is embarrassing. Not happening on my watch.
So you just fired the person that kept sending out emails in your name, because it really seems kind of inappropriate.
Well, it's so there's when you're in a kind of global machine. I mean, I was running a global function, right? So a team of people covering one of the businesses, but you're still subject to a whole load of things imposed on you by the machinery. So there was stuff I controlled that admittedly wasn't being run optimally often. It was being done along the way they'd always done it. So we'll have theoretical rules, and we'll send you on a training course, and then you will understand and do it. And so there was stuff that I could control that I was kind of looking at changing. But there was a whole load of stuff I couldn't, where you'd have a centralized standard imposed from Zurich or wherever. And I just kind of went, this isn't landing well. This is just not landing well. And that's where the behavioral science piece came along, where I just went, if I'm in the business of influencing human decision making, then why are we using methods that no one in their right mind would use in any other context, right? People would look at you weirdly if you did that in other contexts. And so what I started to do was to go, is there a way that we can shamelessly steal ideas from other people that are good at influencing decision making? So advertisers, governments whisper it. And if you're copying the government, you're in real trouble, right? So I looked at the stuff and went, all of these things that had sort of interested me for decades. I'd read all the books. I'd kind of paid attention to it. I was always really curious as a kid. All of that stuff, I suddenly went, whoa, this isn't just like side of desk interesting. This is my job. And so I started to look at what I call bringing science to compliance.
It sounds like a very nice book title, just to interrupt.
That's exactly what that will be coming.
Oh, I see. I've got ESPN. I have got a Sixth Sense or something.
But it's rhyme as reason effect, right? So it must make sense is the first thing to recognize. I just kind of went, there's got to be better. So I tried things that I just shamelessly stole from other contexts. And surprisingly, right, if you think about what makes people tick, think about how people are likely to behave rather than the way you would like them to behave, magically you can come up with better ideas. And so I did that for a while within the world I controlled. And then my boss said, how do you fancy doing this full time? Which was one of those sort of serendipitous moments, because I'd never set out to sort of have a full-time behavioral science role. But he was like, do you fancy doing this? So I was like, okay, took that role, ran a behavioral science function, admittedly a function of one, which was quite challenging because I needed to cobble resources from other places. And then did that for about a year, and then just realized there was a massive opportunity here because this whole compliance and risk industry is not something people naturally think of as needing behavioral science. No one in that space wakes up and goes, what I need here is a behavioral science-led solution. And somehow through a set of magical circumstances in my own experience and curiosity, and probably an unwillingness just to accept that that's the way things were, I kind of stumbled across something. And so what I do now is the things I was doing within UBS, but I help companies primarily in regulated sectors, because you tend not to have a compliance function if you don't have rules you have to comply with, to help them think about how can you get better outcomes from a compliance perspective, but also looking at ethics, which is the big topic at the moment, getting people to do the right thing in a way that's not so easily codifiable. So compliance we tend to think of as rules. Ethics is much more around principles and kind of doing the right thing, much harder to codify. And so I help companies look at that piece and really think about, are they getting good value for money from their compliance and ethics programs? And the answer in most cases is no, because they're not thinking behaviorally.
Okay, hot damn, that's an intro.
There you go.
I was just so relaxed just listening to you talk. It's no wonder you've got a podcast, Christian. You're very good at this. Much better than us. I have to say, compliance is so interesting. I mean, it's a topic of interest outside of the places that you're talking about as well, in terms of just getting people to follow guidelines and adhering to things. It's such an interesting and complicated problem. I mean, from your perspective, are there any sort of key ingredients that need to be in place for compliance to occur? Is there something specific to the sort of situations that you look at, or are there some general takeaways that we can learn about what makes someone compliant?
So look, I think that the first thing to say is that in most cases, and there are some really good exceptions where they get this bang on, and I'll come on to those in a second, but in most cases, compliance is approached as a logical process, and it's approached from an organizational perspective. So you look at it, you're an organization, you go, we need these outcomes, how can we make that happen? And you'll do things that are for the convenience of the organization in terms of covering its backside and in terms of discharging its responsibilities. So that is why you get lots of things get written in policies and rule books, because then the organization can go, we have a rule book here, it's written in the rules, we've covered ourselves. And it's very loyally approached to stuff where you go, if we have to go to court, we will be able to point to the rule book, and then we can show that we. Now that is logical, but it's pretty damn bad, because what it means is you're going, we're covered if we end up going to court, right? That is not a great position to take. But that's the one that most organizations take, which is put it simply, is arse covering, as opposed to saying, how do I make it easy for the people on the ground to do things? And so I think the biggest challenge you face is, right, because it's, nobody wants to do that. I mean, lawyers love it, right? Because that's the raison d'etre. We have covered ourselves in that. But if you think about it, right, the chances of you going to court is pretty slim. And it's going to be covering a very, very small percentage of people. So you're right. You are theoretically, and I say theoretically, covered if you go to court, because you can say it said it in the policy. But one, you don't want that to happen. Number two is I'm not sure it's that defensible anyway, because if you say you didn't comply with the rules, it was written on page 767 of that policy, and you felt that, I don't think a judge is going to sit there and go, that's a reasonable thing to expect people to have waded through. And so I think it lacks weaknesses in that space. So firstly, I don't think it's that effective. But the second bit is we tend not to think about the impact it has on the people that you're not taking to court, which is that you're going to piss them off and you're going to get them, and people are going to make mistakes because you're not helping them to do that piece. So I think the answer is we need to be thinking about this much more from the human side of it. So what do we want the target audience to do? And how can we use behavioral science to do that? Now, if you look at where this stuff is done well, it's done really well in contexts where human screwing up has massive consequences. So think about airlines, think about the nuclear power industry, anything that has a sort of big safety component. They are really good at this stuff. They understand it. They've got the right kinds of checklists. They've thought it through. They recognize that people get tired. They learn from their mistakes. Right? It's really sophisticatedly done. And I find it amazing when you look at something like the airline industry, like planes don't crash that often, right? And when they do, they learn from it and it gets better and better and better. So airline safety in the sky is pretty good. They're terrible at like data security, reputational risk management, all the kind of the other stuff on the ground. It doesn't bleed through into those spaces. And so you see airlines screwing that stuff up. But generally speaking, planes are in the sky and doing a pretty good job of flying around, although less of it at the moment for obvious reasons. And so when I look at this whole challenge of compliance, I think we need to take some of the logic that we get in those successful contexts and say, why don't we do that elsewhere? Why is it that it's the oil and gas industry that's really clever at working out how is it I can get people to wear helmets all the time? How is it I can get people to hold the handrail? How is it I can get people to check that, that they've pressed the right button or that they haven't pressed the right, all of that stuff. But we don't do that in other contexts. And so when I look at things that go wrong, and one of the lovely bits of what I do now is I spend my time trawling, news search and saying, let's see what instances of human risk I can find. Let's see what people have screwed up there. You see repetitions of the same stupid stuff. And we don't seem to learn in those contexts in a way that we do for airlines. So I think the very long-winded answer, I'm good at those, to your question, Sarah, is to say, I think we need to look at this as what problem we're trying to solve, and we need to understand humans better if we want to do it. You wouldn't try and control animals by not understanding how animals operate. And yet, for some reason, because it's people, we have this weird thing where we go, well, we'll approach it theoretically and we'll be okay. And we know from experience that's just not true.
Yeah, and you're, sorry, I just to jump in to follow up here, but your example with the airline industry are you sort of talking about a black box thinking approach to learning from mistakes and sort of implementing sort of systematic improvements? And if so, do you think that that's something that should be being done elsewhere, or is that something that's only really appropriate or only really necessary when you're dealing in environments where the costs of human error are really large?
No, I think we should be looking at this everywhere. It seems really strange to me that we do it in those contexts, and we do it in those contexts because it's visible and there's usually life and death associated with its big issues. So for those things, we think it's really important that we learn from this situation. But we all know human beings screw up. And it's going to happen, and mistakes are going to happen. Actually, mistakes can be really good because if you think about innovation, what is necessary for innovation? Trial and error. Right? How do we find out what works? We play around, we experiment with stuff. And so I look at it and say, I think a lot of organizations, they're terrified of things going wrong. And we have a narrative at the moment of if you make a mistake, you're an idiot. That is quite a pervasive narrative. You don't have to look too far from the White House to recognize somebody that has never made a single mistake in their life. And that's a sign of strength. So they claim. And there is something funny about mistakes aren't valued in that way. So I think the thinking that goes into the black box, which is we need to know what happened so that we can stop it happening again, isn't applied in loads of other contexts. We kind of go, we have zero tolerance for mistakes. We will not accept it. And I think there are some things where you do want zero. I don't want people engaging in fraud. I don't want people engaging in racism, sexism, or there's some certain things you just don't want to have happening. So it's very important. I think you have some red lines, but lots of other things. We create this world where if somebody's made a mistake, they're made to feel guilty. They can't necessarily come forward because they're worried about losing their job or getting in trouble. And so we have this very strange thing where mistakes get naturally hushed up. And we add to that this sort of theoretical world that says, well, we don't tolerate mistakes in this organization because you've been sent on training, we've put things in rules, and we've made it clear what we want you to do. And that's great in theory, but human beings forget things, they're tired, they have other things on their mind. And so I think that black box mentality is part of the solution elsewhere, where if you maintain this unrealistic narrative that people aren't going to make mistakes, that you won't tolerate them, that people shouldn't come forward. And it's not that you say they shouldn't come forward, but if all the signals they get that coming forward is a bad idea, then they're not going to come forward. And they're going to, and of course, one of the big causes of massive problems is they're small problems that got big. And why do small problems get big? Is the answer is nobody says anything. And I have a really interesting theory that if you look at organizations, when something goes wrong, somebody somewhere knew something. Now, they might not have known the full extent, but they will have had an inkling of something happening. And if you could tap into that human knowledge and you could let people on the ground report things early with incentivized in the right way, you would have an amazing kind of human firewall and human radar that would protect you from a whole load of things. But organizations don't encourage that. In fact, they do the opposite, which is there is very limited incentive to come forward because you might have to own the problem. If they can pin it on you, there's a risk of that happening. Maybe you think you're going to get fired, and why bother? Because it's just more effort and work for you, and they're not going to listen anyway. But if we could get past all of those things and look at people and say the average person in the average organization wants to do the right thing. They're not out to commit crimes or do bad things. There's a small percentage that are, but that small percentage isn't going to be controlled by some of the mechanisms. They're going to do it anyway. And we don't think about all of these sorts of dynamics. So I think there's a lot we can learn from those safety critical industries that would help make whatever industry you're in better if we tapped into some of these dynamics.
So if we're looking at these industries which are, as you say, safety critical, you already mentioned the example of like oil and gas being quite good at risk compliance. Is that because they are so safety critical, or is there something else going on there? And why is it so difficult to translate something that works in oil and gas to the financial services?
Well, because so the first thing is the reason that we have those, we've learned from those things, right? So we know that if you get a blow up on an oil rig, that costs life. That's a big thing, right? It's expensive. It causes major problems, and particularly if it's onshore, the environmental and the societal consequences of that are massive. So we've learned over time that we need to regulate these things, and we've regulated them quite tightly. And the thing to think about is that in those situations, it's visible, right? If an oil refinery has an issue, somebody pollutes the Gulf of Mexico, you're going to find out about it. One of the interesting things about financial services is that actually the consequences of the actions of people when they're doing the things that we don't want to have happen is that often those are invisible consequences. You can't see the people that are getting harmed. There is a time lag between the individual doing the thing you don't want and the impact of that being felt. So there's a whole host of reasons why it doesn't immediately sit there. And we know from experience that people are good at judging, or they're better at judging risk they can see. The moment you have any kind of distancing between the act and the consequences, we know behaviorally how we react to that. And so in financial services, you don't see the victim. If you think about subprime mortgages in the US, generally speaking, the people doing the kind of making the massive bucks out of this stuff weren't seeing those people at the end. And a lot of these products that were created, a lot of the mis-selling, the consequences of that were not seen until later down the line. And so if you add all of those two things together, I think the reason the safety critical industries have this stuff is, one, it's visible to us, we've seen it, we recognize the consequences are severe. Financial services, a lot more hidden, takes time to appear. And I think we sort of operated on a basis that financial services will be self-regulating. And there was a little bit of implicit trust there, which had been built up because of the way the industry had developed. So if you think about it, originally, banks were kind of partnerships. And so everybody had their house on the line. So the senior partners in the firm would look around and go, I don't want you doing that because my house is at risk. What happened was the structure of those things changed, and it became, it wasn't sort of owner managed. There was a difference between shareholders and people running the firms that led to different incentives. And so there was a whole host of other factors, I think, that didn't help.
I see. Yeah, I suppose it is very easy to rob a bank from within if you never really have to show your face to the people that you've just robbed. It makes life a bit easier, I
Right.
suppose.
Yeah, a bit of a story of empathy there as well. So if I've understood right, then you're sort of saying that people are more likely to engage in risky behaviors when there's greater distance between them and the consequences, whether that's consequences to themselves or to other people.
Yeah, well,
Is that right?
so think about, let's just take child labor as an example.
Oh,
If you could see that your clothes were being manufactured by children in a factory, you would go, or you take meat eating as an example, right? If you could see actually what happened, your reaction to it is fundamentally different than if it's presented. You're going to buy a sort of plastic box off a shelf or out of a fridge in a supermarket is different to going to see the live animals. Ditto, the poor conditions in the factories are not something that's visible to us. So the more that we feel that we don't feel the real danger, and we're not, the greater the opportunity for us to not have to think about it and therefore potentially come to the wrong decision. And you can see it with car safety is a really good example. What happens every time they introduce a new safety feature? People drive more because it feels safer. And so there's an increase in dangerous driving each time they introduce. Now, overall, it's safer. But you've got people taking more risk because their perception of the risk is that it's been reduced. And of course, when you talk about the safety mechanisms you've put in place, you can outsource your thinking to someone else. So I think one of the things that's interesting, have a look at the way food is packaged. There's a lot of labels on there that talk about, kind of free range. And so there's a world that's been created where we're sort of conned by, environmental labels that we don't bother to say, it's got that label, that must be okay. And I can I can distance myself from it because someone else has taken responsibility for it. And one of the things I think is interesting in life is that we all outsource risk management to someone else. And we have to. So if I get on a plane, I'm not going to go and check out whether they've maintained the aircraft or whether someone's doing air traffic control. I kind of make an assumption that that's happening. And if I fly with
you hope for the best.
Right. But if I fly with a reputable airline, they've got something at stake as well. Right. So there's a piece there. But we have to outsource some stuff because we can't check every single aspect of our existence. Otherwise, we'd never you wouldn't even walk out the door, right? You'd be checking whether the door frame was safe. So we're naturally predisposed to use this. And there's a sort of risk heuristic, if you like, that is, what can I rely on? Can I rely on someone else's judgment of peace? And so if I can find ways to be cognitively lazy around this, by finding somebody else that's done the work for me, that helps me to perceive. So when people talk to me about how safe the car is, I can kind of go, well, that's good, isn't it? That they've checked this stuff out. That must be okay. And so you see this in financial services with some of the disclaimers they put on products, where the disclaimer is basically saying, watch out, you need to pay more attention. And people go, oh, there's a disclaimer. This has been checked out. It's a regulated activity. I'm okay. Mm-hmm. And so I think one of the things about human perception of risk is we're not very good at. We're good if if a lion were to jump out at you now, right? A pretty good idea it's a dangerous situation. But most of the things that we encounter in the 21st century, we have less visibility around. So our propensity to take risks when we shouldn't may well be increased by some of the dynamics that we've got nowadays. So yeah, I don't think we're desperately good at assessing risk, particularly where that risk is hidden.
That's very interesting.
Do you think as well there's an element of, it's not just that, the argument, I guess, that, we have limited cognitive resources and even if we wanted to, we can't assess every risk fully before making a decision. Is there also a sense that sometimes it pays to be willfully ignorant, in a sense of actively avoiding information about, where your clothes get made, even if that's
Totally. Yeah, I mean, if you look at Margaret Heffernan's book on willful blindness, I mean, there's a whole host of their things is we don't bother thinking about these things if we can avoid it, and because it's hard work and stressful and everything else. And one of the ways that we do that is we park a lot on the fact that there are people out there doing it for us. So if you look at financial services regulation, there is a presumption out there where people go, well, they're there to stop bad things from happening. And so if the two main things that kind of went wrong in the crisis was what they call conduct, which is bad behavior. So mis-selling, market abuse, those sorts of things. Or the second one was what they call prudential risk, which is basically banks failing and blowing the world up, right? Because the consequences of that failure on the markets is so substantial. Now, one of the things that's interesting is there's a presumption you have a regulator. It's going to eliminate all of the bad behavior, and it is going to stop banks from failing. We're never going to have a bank fail. And that's impossible to guarantee in both cases. So actually, the prudential regulator, the one I worked at, has an approach that says actually banks are going to fail. And what we're going to do is we're going to recognize that, and we're going to make sure that when they fail in an orderly manner, so that you don't have queues of people trying to get their money out of the door and it crashes and causes mass panic. And we're going to do it in a manner that protects people's deposits and. But there is an inherent presumption that the reason you have a regulator, and you can replicate this inside firms, the reason you have a compliance function, is to make sure none of these things ever happen. In the same way that we all look and we assume the security services are there to make sure we don't have terror attacks. Sure. And so it's always perceived that when something does happen, that those bodies have failed, and we're all a bit shocked. How could that happen? And that's in part because we've outsourced it so that we don't have to understand it. Mm-hmm. And we sort of we rely on these things. And I think the trouble is, what is the point of reasonable reliance? Clearly we have to rely to a certain extent on other people, mm-hmm. and it's reasonable to outsource a percentage of that. But the expectations that come with that are quite punchy. And I think we intentionally abuse that slightly and sort of allow ourselves to be lulled into a false sense of security and saying, well, somebody else has this covered, so I don't need to. And that plays itself out in the way that we all individually behave. And so you can see that to a certain extent, you see that within organizations where somebody goes, if I haven't been told that I can't do this, I'm going to assume it's okay, right? Which is a very deluded approach to things, but it helps. Some people can justify actions by going, well, if they didn't want me to do it, they would have stopped me. As they haven't stopped me, I'm okay.
So on that point specifically, maybe a slightly strange question, but is there a regulator of regulators? Like, how far does this chain move upwards?
So the answer, there are bodies. I mean, the quick answer is, when would you stop? Right, you'd have to keep going these things. So the regulators come under a heck of a lot of scrutiny themselves, and one of the biggest bits of scrutiny is when something goes wrong, you get poured over in a really quite aggressive way because there's an expectation that that if something's gone wrong and an undesirable outcome occurred, your job was to stop it, and you didn't. You get thoroughly investigated, and I've seen those investigations happen, and there are bodies within governments that look at these things and assess it. And then the other bit of scrutiny you've got, which will probably make you laugh given we're sitting, but Parliament also has scrutiny. So the heads of the regulators are called to Parliament to account for themselves. Now, there's a little bit of me that goes, what right have they got? But at some point you have to stop with that, because otherwise you just need overseers of overseers of overseers of overseers, and it sort of runs out of steam. But yes, there's far more scrutiny on regulators than I think people realise, which actually makes regulation a bit harder, because you're having to engage in defensive decision making. So you're doing things, because a certain amount of regulation is taking a risk. It's about thinking, okay, I'm trying to stop this particular thing. What is it I can do to try and control the behavior of the people, back to the human risk piece, within the organizations that I'm regulating? And if you're overly prescriptive, you'll have unintended consequences. If you're not prescriptive enough, you'll have people so that becomes an interesting game. So there's a lot of risk associated with regulation that people, again, like to think is just straightforward. Why didn't you stop that from happening? Well, if it were, often you have to balance different priorities, and there's information, hindsight bias. Great example of with hindsight, it's pretty obvious X was going to happen, but that the scrutiny that they're under is quite extensive, and I think that's one of the problems, is that because of this expectation that regulators will cover all these things, when they don't, they get absolutely hammered. Sometimes justifiably, but sometimes not. And one of the things I do like to talk to people about when they sort of say, well, awful regulators didn't stop happening, I go, it's quite a pressured environment. And you're setting yourself quite an impossible task, which is to minimize a huge amount of risk that is not always within your control.
Yeah. And how do you stop people from passing the buck? Because that seems to be the running thread through all of this, of passing off responsibility to someone else, whether that's someone further down the management chain or onto a regulator, rather than...
So historically, it was literally just you point at anyone else. It was him, it was her, it was her. And so you get these crazy things where firms would outsource processes. So you'd have like payment systems or something, right? You go, we will outsource this. Now, part of the reason you outsource is it's cheaper, right? So if I can go and find someone else to do it more cheaply, I don't have to have it in-house. I'll get it, and they'll do it more cheaply than I ever could. Now, how are they doing it more cheaply? The answer is, okay, there's efficiencies in scale and blah, blah, but there's also because they're cutting corners. You don't have anywhere near as much control. And people used to blame that and go, well, we outsourced it to them. And so one of the early things they discovered, they sort of said to firms was outsourcing is not an excuse, right? You can't offlay that responsibility. So you can delegate the task to someone else, but you can't delegate the responsibility. That will always remain with you. So they've tightened that up a bit. But you're right. That was the problem historically. It was always someone else's fault, and you you could sort of see it's proverbial kind of, if responsibility were a parcel, you could see it being thrown around the room as quickly as possible, so that somebody else is left holding it at the end of the game. They've tried to really cut down on that now by saying, look, actually, we'll look through all of that and we'll go, you're in charge, you're being paid the big bucks, you are accountable. And so they found senior people within financial services organizations where they go, if something blows up and you're accountable for it, I don't care why that happened, it's your problem and your responsibility. So they've dealt with that upper piece, but the challenge that I'm painting here is how do those people discharge their responsibility? They discharge it in a way that's behaviorally really unintelligent, because they discharge it in a theoretical manner. So these techniques I've talked about around having clunky processes that sort of feel like they would look good in a courtroom don't work in practice. And so one of the things I think is interesting is that secondary cascading piece is still happening. The top bit is court, right? People, if a firm blows up, something goes wrong, that person will be paying for that. But I would like to try and stop that thing from happening in the first place. And the way you'll do that is by having processes within the firm that actually understand people, that actually get human dynamics and think about the things that we all know work well or don't work so well.
So I'm interested in the sort of the challenge of how to design these processes then. If you were going to come at this from a more behavioral science approach, I mean, for example, I don't know, a reporting mechanism. Like if people make mistakes on the job, how do we design a reporting procedure and mechanism that leads to compliance, where these small mistakes are picked up before they lead to something
so that's
big?
That's a big one, but let's tackle it, right? So the logical traditional approach, which you see a lot of firms adopt, they'll go, we need to respond. So what we'll do is we'll build processes that will solve this problem. So we will say to everybody, you need to report more things, right? And we'll create a whistleblower hotline, and we'll have all sorts of options, and we will track how many reports we get, and we will encourage people to report things, and we'll tell them to report things. Right? That's the traditional approach.
Okay.
And, right. Which from a behavioral perspective, people are going to go, this is bullshit, right? This has been put there so that they can feel good about it. And of course, then let's go a little bit further on the behavioral side and think about what message does that send? If you're not careful, the message I get is, Christ, I can't report anything internally. It's so bad, right? That they need to set up this external thing because they're not willing to listen normally. That's the only way they can get information. So the more they double down on this, you need to report stuff. You would sit there and go, wow, I've really got to think about it. So you up the stakes massively by having this structure. Mm-hmm. The second thing, if you incentivize people to report stuff, they'll just come up with, they will tick that box. So they'll report frivolous crap to you just to get the numbers up. Mm-hmm. So, we need more reporting. You'll end up with the carpet was a bit loose type things. And so people will respond to the incentives you put in front of them. Mm-hmm. So how do you actually, of course, you need to have those independent whistleblower lines. But if that's your only route, then that's not going to work. So how could we behaviorally do that? Well, the answer is we have to think about what incentives are there for people to report stuff. Now, you could say, well, we'll bribe them, right? Anybody who reports something gets paid. That, we know what will happen there. You will incentivize nonsense reporting. But maybe you say, okay, that's the best weapon we've got. We'll accept the fact there'll be a load of noise, and that will flesh some things out. So that would be a start. But a much more effective way to do it would be to say, okay, I will shift the incentives of reporting in the favor of reporting. And how will I do that? Well, the answer is, firstly, people want to feel good about doing it. So they want to know that they will be supported. So if somebody comes forward, you need to make sure that they are praised for doing it, that they are given the support to deal with it, that there's appropriate confidentiality if they've reported something. And you need to send a signal to the organization that this is something you want. So a really good example of this I saw was at British Airways, where in their in-house magazine, they have a thing called Mistake of the Month. And so in the staff magazine, where in most organizations, they wang on about sales and sort of, kind of, it's almost like it's the sort of stuff you'd write for an external audience. You see kind of, we have, new sales. The British Airways one I thought was fascinating because it contained things like details on uniforms, operational information, but they had a whole thing about mistakes being made and what people had learned from it. And I thought that's a really interesting signal, because you're giving away real estate in an internal propaganda magazine to talk about mistakes. And I read an interview with the then CEO, who he just said, look, we've got 60,000 people, whatever. The idea that no one makes a mistake is nonsense. I've got to show them that we care about them making mistakes. Now, it is a supremely highly curated column, right? It's not, I got pissed last night and still managed to land the plane in Rio. So the one I saw was something like, I'm responsible for managing buses between location shipping staff. And we realized that we were running a number of bus routes that were journeys that nobody would ever want to make. And so by reappraising that, we've saved 20, I'm making numbers up now, right? 20 million on the bus. So heavily curated, sensible. But
that's not really a mistake. That's just,
well, it's okay, but it's
inefficient.
So the mistake was that he had planned it the wrong way, right? So somebody had not looked at the change in working patterns to as they were looking at it. But I've looked at a few other examples, and there are things like, somebody accidentally wiped a whole load of data. And what we discovered was that the architecture made it really easy for people with that, because the difference between clicking the do you want to delete yes, do you want to delete no button wasn't clear. So we redesigned that thing. So there's lots of, but the idea there is that you praise people for coming forward and you support them and you recognize that. So that's action speaking louder than words. And one of the interesting things, I think, when you try and solve for behavioral problems is that people are, the natural go-to thing is, let's have a theoretical mechanism that looks good on paper that can tick the box. Whereas we know that, what is going to drive the behaviors in reality? Well, the answer is social proof. So do I think other people are pointless? How am I going to look like an idiot? Am I going to waste my time? Am I putting my career on the line? Those are the things that you have to deal with. And so when it comes to, the natural tendency is we will reward people. And I go, no, don't do that. Think about, do reward them, but not financially, because you don't want to create the wrong sort of incentives. You need to think about some of these pieces. And that's where, when you start to think behavior around this stuff, you can come up with some really interesting ideas from other contexts. So I love looking and going, what do we do in schools to get kids to behave in the right way? How can we take that and put it in a work context? What technique is being used by a supermarket to get me to queue in an orderly fashion? What technique is being used by the government to get me to, what techniques? Yeah, and there's a list of things not to do, as opposed to. So I look around and I go, something that works, I don't know, let's pick a silly example. Something that works in the cinema to get me to queue up properly or to buy more popcorn can have an impact on how I persuade people to think about compliance issues internally. But we never do that. We spend a heck of a lot of money on controlling people's behavior internally in a way that, if you were doing this externally, right, if you were saying, I am responsible for the marketing budget, right, and I have a 20 million budget and I'm going to spend this money to persuade consumers to buy our product, you would have that analyzed and go, how do you know you're spending money effectively? You do research, right? Whereas compliance, you can spend the same amount of money. And bear in mind, it's not just your staff, it's the staff's time that you're wasting as much as the money you're spending on processes. You, for some reason, if you're in a compliance function, you're allowed to just do this stuff. Crack on, do these things, because it comes with this regulatory badge. And so that thinking around, is this actually working, isn't there. They measure effectiveness, literally. How many people have we caught doing this? And there's a lot of negative metrics. So you measure things by how many people have breached this rule. Now, I would sit there and say, it's not a sign of effective compliance program if you have lots of people breaching a rule. You actually want to design it so then. Now, that's not to say you change what you're monitoring so that and that's another trick. Of course, you look at it and go, well, we'll just change the way we look at things. Maybe that's not, maybe 10 people breaching this rule is not so bad. We'll recalibrate a little bit. But there's all these sort of ideas that come from other fields that we don't deploy in the compliance. We rely on these theoretical models. And I think, that's where we can get really creative. And firms are spending billions on this stuff in a way they wouldn't do in other contexts. And that's the bit that's anathema to me, is I go, you're trying to influence people. It just happens to be an internal audience that you think you can just tell what to do because that you employ them. And I would go, you need to think about them a little bit more like you do customers and go, yes, they'll do what they're told. But in the 21st century, employees can run riot and do crazy things because we give them huge power in keyboards and access to things. And even outside work, your behavior is tied back to your employer. So all of your employees are little risk units running around, no matter how junior they are. And we don't think about it. We just go, they're employed by us. We will tell them what to do. That doesn't work. And so what I'm trying to do is to kind of take that agenda of saying we have these units of risk, and we tend to think of people as assets, but they're actually huge liabilities when they screw up. How can we get that? How can we contain that? And the answer is the traditional methodologies don't work. We've got to be thinking more behaviorally.
Super fascinating. Super, super fascinating. Wow. Okay. So is it just you leading the front on this? Are there other people working on this right now? Because it sounds like it's a big job, right?
Yeah. Well, so I had a very unique set of circumstances that opened my eyes. And not everybody that goes, no kid grows up wanting to be a compliance officer, right? And I should add, why do they call it compliance officers? The only example I can think of in the world where adding the word officer to something makes it worse, but it's a hideous piece of branding, right? So it tends not to attract people that think creatively, or innovatively, and that's a gross generalization. There are some great people in that, but it's not something any kid grows up wanting to do. So I'm battling against a piece, and I get really frustrated because I'm like, man, why does nobody see this? And then of course I flip it around and go, if they did, I wouldn't have an opportunity, right? So I've spotted it. So I can't be simultaneously excited by the opportunity and pissed off by the fact that no one else gets it. But yeah, there's a few people out there doing some interesting things. And so there are people with solutions. So I work with a company that does compliance design, which sounds like a contradiction in terms, but what they do is they design compliance collateral, so checklists and posters and processes that companies can customize themselves that have behavioral science fused in to think about how can you communicate to people in a way that is behaviorally intelligent, getting them the information they need when they need it. At the point when it's going to have the most impact. And so there's examples of products there. And there's a few people operating in my space, but there's not that many. And, one of the interesting bits is when I look at what I'm doing and how that fits into the behavioral science world is that I'm at the really early stage of working with companies to start to think about this stuff. And so when I talk to them about behavior, they hire me in because I can talk about things and point things out to them. They're not interested in running RCTs. Right,
sure.
because they're miles off that. And the answer is you don't need, and this is where I get into real sort of interesting discussions with some of the sort of academic people, is because people say, well, how do you know this stuff works? And I'm saying, I'm not trying to optimize solutions here. What I'm doing is I'm coming in and going, it is so bad. It is so silly that I don't need to run any kind of trial to tell you that actually something that is just take a basic behavioral science framework, deploy on that, you'll go, what you are doing is terrible. So there's a heck of a lot, for example, of negative social proof. One of the ways that you get people to be more compliant in organizations is you send around an email saying that there have been large numbers of breaches of the policy and that this is unacceptable. Right? That's a traditional logical approach. Right? What does that do? It communicates two messages. Anybody that's breaching the policy will go, oh, good, I'm not on my own, because they wouldn't have sent the email around if I was the only person. So there must be loads of us out there. Awesome. And to the people that are compliant, they'll go, screw this, right? Why am I bothering to be compliant if all these other sods are not doing it? And I know there must be loads of them because they wouldn't have sent the email out there. So that's a basic example of natural tendency is we'll just send this out. Behavioral implication is you are spraying negative social proof everywhere. So one of the simple things I do is I point that out and go, there are better ways that you could communicate this thing. And maybe shining a light on something you don't want to have happening is the worst possible way of doing it. So I'm not, many of the clients I work with, I'm not running RCTs. I'm not doing anything sophisticated. I'm just going in there and going, let's just take it back to basics. And if I can get compliance rates up from 10% to 70% by doing some small things, that is good enough, right? They're not interested in the fact that I could get you up to 80 or 72 if I tested all these things out and we could work. As long as I can improve things, that's better. And so we're at this very, very early stage where literally, first, I have to persuade people that they're in the business of influencing human decision making. And the second bit is then let's try some of this stuff out. Now, ideally, if I've got clients that are enlightened, they'll go, let's try these things out, see what happens. But generally speaking, they just go, I want to roll this out now. Now that you've pointed out how awful this is, we need to do this. And there are some things that you can do that I can guarantee will get better results than what you're doing now. I can't guarantee it's going to be best result. I can never guarantee you 100% compliance, but I can improve stuff. So it's very early stage. And what I'm trying to do is two things. One is sort of evangelize a little bit in the space that I'm working with and talk about this stuff. So in the hope that people grab it and run with it and kind of just start to wake up. And the second thing is, I'm growing the market. And so the way I get market share is by growing the market, because nobody in that space wakes up and goes, I need some behavioral science help, because they've never even thought about it in those terms. And so a lot of why I love doing this, because I just kind of point stuff out and I go, would you do this in another context? And they go, no, that would be awful. You go, why are you doing it here? Right? Why is it suddenly okay to do it within your organization? It's almost like you're sort of behaving as if your employees have rocked up, and for some reason you expect them to check in all of their normal reactions and human behaviors at the door. Check your baggage in at the door and then become an employee. And that's not the way we operate, which is really weird in a world where you've hired them because they're intelligent and free thinking and creative and blah, 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 blah. But somehow you treat them so you hire intelligent people and treat them like they're dumb. So I'm trying to shift these kind of pieces. And so I talk a lot about it, and hopefully it resonates with some people. And I keep finding people going, I knew there was something wrong. I've been doing some stuff, but I didn't know about behavioral science. I didn't know this was a thing. I recognized it was not working. Yeah. And that's a lovely moment, because you go, so intuitively, you've probably got there without even having read any of the books. And then they go, there's books on this stuff? This is incredible. And so there's that lovely, that Tversky thing around he and Kahneman were just codifying things that marketers and used car salespeople knew all along. Yeah. I love this stuff, because you talk to people, there's books on this stuff? This is amazing. And you go, yeah, just think about that context. And so those people I can then tap into. And I think what's interesting is that human beings know when they're doing pointless things, right? We all know intuitively when we're involved in pointless bureaucracy and pointless, go and engage with the government on a process, and you'll understand that we all intuitively get this. And so what I find fascinating is if I can get compliance people to sort of wake up a little bit, they will do a lot of this kind of thing. Oh my God, is there another way we could do this? And you're like, yep. And then you get the regulators won't like this. And I'm like, that's a whole other battle. But again, we can argue, we can fight that one.
That's for tomorrow.
Right. But it's also not true. And people, it's a convenient excuse, right? We can't possibly do that because the regulator said so. And you see all kinds of vested interests as to why if I've built up an army of people to do pointless controls, right? The message I'm sending is not particularly welcome, because I'm going to go, you can get rid of half of that. But then I'll lose my and particularly if you're the architect of crappy old systems, you're not going to want me to come in and point out whether. So there's a lot of people that naturally resist it, but I think there's a heck of a lot of people out there who want job satisfaction, who work in compliance and risk, and who are going to go, actually, that makes a hell of a lot of sense. I'd love to try some of this stuff. So it's sort of resonating. And I want to kind of just get people involved and interested in this topic, and my kind of business will flourish off the back of that. And therefore, I want to kind of evangelize a little bit, and clearly not in his anywhere near with his panache, but kind of do a Rory in my space and really promote this stuff and get people excited and thinking for themselves. And then hopefully this thing can go somewhere.
I mean, you've got enough energy to make this work, Christian. You can be the Rory within risk compliance. I feel like that won't be an issue whatsoever. So I have a quick question about something you said earlier. So this field is very much still at the forefront of applying behavioral science, and you can do quite a few more basic things to actually make quite a lot of a difference. As you already said, you can take someone from 10% to 70% compliance. So when we're talking about basic things, are we talking about nudge, default, mindspace, the East framework? Are we talking that type of stuff?
Yeah. Any and all of those things, and it's simply because the discipline that's there has operated on a theoretical basis, right? So it's literally like it's an economic model, but it's a sort of it's a regulatory model, right? Which is it operates on a very theoretical basis. So the moment you start to go through some of those pieces and you sort of say, have you thought about how easy this is? Have you thought about who your messenger is? The answer will be no, because the context is always, we are the employer and we can tell you what to do, right? There's an assumed set of rights that has meant they've never thought about these particular things. And so there are certain contexts in which that's perfectly okay, right? So nuclear power industry, food safety, all of these safety critical areas, it is perfectly acceptable. Employees accept, everybody understands why you're going to be told exactly what to do and how to slavishly follow the rules. But many of the other contexts that people are operating in, actually, you can't codify something. What does behave ethically mean? Well, you need a bit of help with interpretation, and you can't codify that, because if you start to codify it, you'll get unintended consequences. And so you have to accept that in the 21st century, people need, we need to think very differently about how we send messages to employees. And so these traditional methods, a heavily codified rule book looks really good on paper, terrible from a user experience because I have to read all that crap. I'm not going to do that. Screw that. I'm a man. I don't read instruction manuals, right? Which is why the iPhone's super successful because there isn't one that comes with it. It's been designed so that I can just pick it up. We need to think in those terms, and that's not the way that they tend to operate. So when I talk about bringing science to compliance, it's all of that stuff. So I get a lot of people who've read Nudge that I work with and go, oh, we're doing nudging. And I'm like, yes, but don't kind of constrain yourself to that world because actually there are times in the space where you are perfectly entitled to be very, very prescriptive to people, right? We don't have to worry about whether it's appropriate or not for you to tell people to mitigate this risk. We don't have to think about that because but we mustn't take that approach for every single thing that we want people to do. And so there are times where we can use other techniques. So I would say I sit, when I look at it as it's a behavioral design challenge and sort of going, what impact is this actually having on the ground? And is it the impact that you thought you were having? And let's have a look at what you're not seeing. So very often people declare success because they say, well, this has worked because everybody's signing the piece of paper, right? Everybody's doing their training on time. To which I go, you can make people turn up to training and sign the box to say they're going to train and maybe pass an exam at the end of it. But actually, do they really understand the underlying topic? Or if you just taught them the name of the regulation, how many years they'll go to, literally some of the questions on the mandatory training in banking is, failure to comply with this law will see you go to jail for 5, 10, 15 or 20 years.
Oh.
Right. That is a useless piece. No, it's designed to scare you. So we're testing something that's easily testable, right? So have they paid attention? Did they note how many years they go to jail for? Now, I sit there going, it's useless information. You need to know that the consequences of screwing this up are pretty serious. But I don't want someone sitting there going, hey, this one's a 5 years in jail versus that one's 20. I'll go with the 5 years in jail misdemeanor. Right? It's ludicrous information. And the test is designed around what is easy for the organization to test, not what do we need people to know. And so there's an example of a sort of theoretical model that looks good. And they go, we've got scores of 100% on our exam, right? Asking people stupid questions that are never going to be relevant in the real world that they live in. So shifting that piece into a world where you say it's quite unpleasant for some people, right? Because I'm sitting there going, the processes you've evolved make perfect sense. If people had nothing else to do, they were 100% logical and rational. And there weren't 1,000,001 other things going on in their lives and situations, and there weren't other people involved, then you'd be fine. Unfortunately, that is not what you have hired. Nope. And because, unfortunately, you've decided to employ human beings, right? You need to think about some of those consequences. And that's the stage of the journey that we're at. So I bring a complete behavioral toolkit. And very often I don't even get into the language of kind of nudging or whatever. I'll do it if people are interested in it. But I will literally let's talk about the real world. Let's talk about that, going and queuing at the post office is quite instructive as an example of something where you would go, that's irritating and annoying. And you say, if it's annoying in the real world, it's annoying in the office. So don't be surprised if your process is the equivalent of queuing up in the post office when people give up and go somewhere else and they do something else. And so those, and it's quite good to pick examples that aren't anything to do with work, because then it's not criticizing them. I'm just highlighting something and I lead the witness a little bit and I go, hey, look, think about this particular done. And they go, yeah, that's awful. And then they go, oh, that's quite similar to what we do. And you go, really? And of course, I've led them to that point. So I don't even necessarily get into that language. It's literally just kind of going, let's think about things and let's find examples where somebody else has solved the problem in another context that we can just borrow.
So really getting people to think about their own experiences and make connections, I guess, between what happens within the workplace and outside of the workplace.
Yeah, and it's also looking and saying, depending on who you're talking to in an organization. So if I'm talking to senior people in an organization, find those bits of the compliance framework that are most irritating to them, right? And typically in organization, there's lots of rules in organizations around things like conflicts of interest. And in banks, what you're allowed to invest in because of that piece. So if you're a senior person in the bank, you have more money, you probably have more extracurricular activities, other directorships, blah, 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 blah. So the bits that they will fall foul of that will never apply to junior people are those rules that are designed to either prevent actual conflicts of interest or perceptions of conflicts of interest. And so I talk about those things. Did you find that irritating? They're like, yeah. And so you start to go, well, that's an example of the sort of thing. And of course, they're not seeing the things that impact the junior people who are having to follow tedious bureaucratic processes. But if I can find things that intrinsically irritate them as my illustrations and compare that to other experiences that they've got in the outside world, and you make that linkage, if you've got them on the hook for something that irritates them, chances are they'll suddenly go, oh yeah, wow, that's really, and you go, there is another way that we could do things if you had a bit of courage here and thought about it differently. So yeah, but it's playing to that visceral piece. So the big question I ask people, if I want to get feedback on where are you likely to be running risks in your organization, is ask people this simple question. It's deliberately phrased to be slightly provocative, which is, what pisses you off? And I use that phrase because you don't want something that's a bit annoying, right? You want something that really pisses you off, because what do you do when something pisses you off, right? You find ways around it. We generally, as human beings, don't just accept that. And so that for me is the ultimate. If I go around an organization and I go, what pisses you off? And I get the same standard message, that's a really good leading indicator for something that people are either breaching or circumventing as a rule or will do in the future. Because at some point we all kind of, and we rationalize it. So there's a lovely, that's why I say humans are a great risk indicator, because just talk to people and go, what irritates you? If something irritates you or bores you or wastes you or feels like a waste of time, what do? You don't engage with it, or you do the bare minimum. That's not what you want with some of these topics that we're talking about.
Gotcha. So this field is, I mean, as we already said, young, like really, really young. So one of my favorite questions is always, where do you think this field is going to be at in about 10 years' time? Like, are you expecting changes and developments to be quite slow, or is this going to be growing exponentially and quite rapidly?
Look, if I have my way, it's going to grow super rapidly. But I think what's really interesting is when because I'm not painting a theory that I've got from a textbook, right? I'm talking about real life experiences. And I think one of the things that's interesting that, COVID is to a certain extent exposing as well, is we're calling bullshit on a lot of things. And whether that's the sort of, patriarchal society, whether that's the privilege, whether that's stupid process, things that we used to do in the old world that we kind of recognize are a bit dumb. Did we all need to travel as much as we did? So there's lots of things I think that are being, and I'd like to think this is going to sit in that category, because as people start to reflect on, why am I spending my time doing this when there's a better way? And the homeworking thing I think is fascinating, because suddenly in an office, you would kind of go, I'm at the whim of all the processes, and I'm stuck on their system using their machine. And I sort of accept that this is an environment where that happens. If you're at home, you've actually got loads of other indicators of people that are really good at grabbing your attention, that are really good at engaging with you, that have found ways of using digital format much more effectively. So people are on social media, and you don't have that kind of sort of bureaucratic cage. You can see other people that are doing this stuff really well. And I'd like to think that people start to go, why is it that I can talk to Amazon, I get much better service out of Amazon than I can out of my compliance or my risk or my whatever function at work? That's not good enough. And one of the lovely things for me being self-employed, right, is I can choose what software I use. There's a whole load of tools out there I didn't know about, because the corporate environment, when we're not having that, and partly because, you don't want to roll, it's easier for me to roll it out in a company of one than it is in rolling out a company of tens of thousands. But nonetheless, you look at it and go, we are stifling. And I think people will start to see this stuff, and you'll start to recognize things that make no sense. So this whole trend of exposing inefficiencies, I'm hoping plays smack into this space of going, this is really silly. This is a real waste of my time, and I'm not gonna stand for it. And whether that's senior people getting pissed off or the people doing it start to go, this sucks, and start to and I'm being a little bit agitating, because I want to get junior compliance people to go, there's a better way that we could do this. And look, I don't want to do this job anymore because it involves me doing something I don't think adds value.
Fair play.
Well, we wish you good luck trying to get people to overcome their sunk costs of not doing things the way that they've always done things, and overcome their sort of status quo bias, for sure. As we wrap up the podcast, we've talked about so much today, but I guess if you could leave the listener with one or two takeaways or something you would like them to think about beyond the episode, what would you leave them with?
Two things. I think one when we talk about human risk is we often think about eliminating risk. right? And the idea that risk is bad. And every single business is going to be running risk. If people want to survive, if organizations want to survive in the 21st century, that involves experimentation and innovation. So we shouldn't be trying to eliminate human risk. We should be trying to get the right kind of human risk and getting the most out of people. And there's this urge to eliminate things. And I think actually we should be trying to curate the sorts of risks that we're running. The second thing is, if you are trying to control a population to get them to do something, thinking about them not as supplicants, you sort of North Korean supplicants to your dictatorship, but actually going, let's think about how this feels to them. And that doesn't matter whether you're a university, whether you're in a bank, whatever organization you're in. If you are issuing instructions or trying to get people to do something, think behaviorally and think about it from the audience's perspective. And that takes you so far. And yet there are so many people that seem incapable of doing that. And that, for me, is a societal wish. If people thought more about what they want things from the target audience perspective, we'd all have much easier, much more fulfilled lives.
Beautiful. Love it.
There we go.
So I guess with that, the very last thing that you can add is where people can find you and follow you on this journey. So
feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn. If you just search for Human Risk, you can find me there. Human-risk.com is my website. Human Risk blog on Twitter. There's also YouTube and blah, 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 but that's probably more than enough.
You don't want to plug the newsletter? One of the most famous letters in behavioral science?
I could plug my newsletter, I could plug my podcast, but if people go to human-risk.com, they'll find all of those things. And look, thank you very much for having me, because it's been an absolute pleasure. I've thoroughly enjoyed being here.
Thank you so much.
Thanks so much for coming on. We've really enjoyed speaking with you today.
So that was us talking to the amazing Christian Hunt. As predicted, I feel like I've gotten an education. At least I feel like I've got a stronger grip on what it means to be compliant, or what compliance and applying behavioral science to compliance is about, or applying the science to compliance. Very good book title, Christian. Very good. Whenever this book comes out, I'll be very eager to read it. So, Sarah, what is the main thing you took away today?
Well, I didn't realize I was going to be talking to the Rory Sutherland of risk and compliance today. I would have dressed up. No, I'm joking. I kid, Christian. I mean, first of all, I think it's such an interesting journey of how Christian came to be a behavioral scientist, like a
convoluted journey.
Yeah, convoluted and unique, but also super interesting. And I'm always interested in people's backstories and trying to find some sort of narrative semblance there. I love it. But I think the thing that most interested me is about this question of how do we handle the risk, or how do we design systems that lead to better outcomes. I know whenever we have humans involved, right, whenever we have that human factor, it's always that little bit of unpredictability, or behavioral scientists would argue in some cases predictability, like predictable mistakes. Talking about airlines and how in one aspect of their business they can be really effective and efficient at sort of reporting mistakes. So whenever there's like a plane crash or something goes wrong in the cockpit, people are that industry is very sort of keyed in on getting that information and actually putting in place systematic improvements. But in other parts of the industry, we don't see a similar model. And I know different contexts, but I think Christian's point about the fact that we can learn so much by just looking and seeing how other people, where the stakes are much higher, and so it really pays them to put in place these effective systems. How do they do this? How do they increase compliance? It's such an interesting and complex question. I know. What did you make of all of it?
I think you raised a really, really interesting point. I do wonder to some extent, so if you're not dealing with lives, or livelihoods, if you will, although livelihoods, if we're looking into the financial sector, people seem to be a lot less compliant. So let's just focus on lives. Then, like you said, there's these massive systems in place, and people, as a result, are quite compliant because the stakes are so high. But I'm wondering if, copy-pasting that system into a different sector where the stakes are different and I suppose less severe than losing a life, whether you would be able to implement that in the same way and how you would have to adjust it. So if the stakes are lower, does it have to be like a system light or like a full fat system with, additional toppings? You can tell I'm
Yeah.
getting quite hungry. But it's
Me
mainly
too.
that it's, once you change the stakes, how does the system also need to change to be as effective as it can be? And what direction does it need to change in? Like, is the relationship between the severity of the system and the severity of the stakes, is that negatively or positively correlated? I don't
Yeah.
know. I would like to know.
I think it's definitely endogenous, right? So the industry that you work in and the sort of the stakes of human error will affect, I guess, how many mistakes people make, but
Sure.
also obviously the cost of them, right? So maybe you'll find in sort of high safety critical industries that fewer mistakes are made, but the cost of them are incredibly high,
Sure.
right? Whereas in other industries, you'll probably get more mistakes being made, but the cost of them by themselves, maybe the probability that a small mistake turns into a large mistake is much smaller. So I do think the system would have to adapt to those type of mistakes. I don't know, maybe smaller mistakes are more embarrassing in a sense because
Not a clue. Not a
yeah,
clue.
I don't know. This is I want to do research on this, so this is why I'm just sort of pondering some open questions. But I mean, one sort of way that I guess the airline industry was trying to increase compliance was Christian told us about this magazine, right? This
Oh
British
no. No.
Airways
No.
Mistake of the Month publication. I know Mel has
No.
strong feelings. You would never have guessed Mel has strong feelings about this, but you know, do you have any thoughts about this, my friend?
I have plenty. I think it's a complete fucking cop out. I think the idea is good. That is not the issue, but it's the execution I have problems with, because the way it's now being presented is very much like, oh, it's not even, some of it is not even mistakes, or some of it to be, I mean, there's mistakes in there. Oh, I wiped a bunch of data. Okay, fucking reset the system. Like, you will be able to retrieve that, very likely. Like, it is a mistake if none of British Airways or airlines or whatever has a backup somewhere. That's a mistake. I'll give you that. But that's not what's happening. But this thing of
Yeah.
like, oh, we were running inefficient routes. That's not a mistake. It's an inefficiency. Like, to me, that qualifies on a very different level. And then, it doesn't even get posted until it's fixed. So it's very much like, we reevaluated our system, and, we found an inefficiency, and we're totally embarrassed about this. Oh, but then we fixed it, so now we're better than ever. I'm like, that's not what I'm looking for. This is, no. It's
Yeah.
very
So-
Americanized. I don't like this. This doesn't agree with me.
I apologize to all our American listeners if you're out there, but
You know
no,
what I mean.
I know. I think it's highly curated and staged.
Yes.
But I think what it does is, as you said, you sort of agree with the idea of it. And I would sort of say that I think part of the problem with getting people to report human error, I mean, human error is inevitable, right? We know that even in a perfect system, as long as there's humans involved, mistakes will be made. So whenever there is an instance of a mistake or you sort of take the wrong decision, let's say, then I think something really important is about how stigmatized mistakes are within a company, whether or not people associate mistakes with being stupid or inadequate. In which case, there's the stakes almost of reporting these mistakes massively increase. So I guess what British Airways is trying to do is normalize making mistakes in a very highly curated way, right? And in a very, their stakeholders are going to be very impressed by the fact that they've cut costs, right? By 0.5% by making this systematic improvement. But that is really what black box thinking is. It's about finding systematic errors or sort of places in the system where people are repeatedly making the same hiccup and putting in some sort of systematic improvement. But yeah, maybe there's a sense that the mistakes that they are choosing, I mean, I know that it was just one example that Christian gave, but that sort of mistake minimizes the role of humans being involved, right? It was just sort of no one made the intentional decision to be like, no, it's a really good idea for us to do this bus route. Maybe they just inherited it, or maybe they just copied the bus routes from another airport or things like that. So it's a more unintentional mistake, right? So
Sure.
In that sense, the stakes of coming forward for that type of mistake are very small as well. So I do think it's interesting, and obviously I could talk about this forever.
Oh, she could. She really could. I think on an ending note, how do you feel? Because you've got higher stakes in this subfield than I do. So how do you see it develop? Because I mean, Christian has mentioned that applying behavioral science to risk and compliance is, I mean, there's people in the field, but like, there's not many people in the field. And I think if you join the field now, you might already be very much at the front line.
Yeah, I think it's an example of a sort of an arena where behavioral science, just by getting people to think about things in a different way, in sort of a less theory-driven way, can lead to improvements. So it's a sort of an anything is better than nothing approach at the moment to sort of applying behavioral science, which is important and lays the groundwork and is a sort of a proof of concept for a lot of people, right, to challenge the sort of status quo bias and sort of sunk costs of having to change systems that have been in place and people know. So it's an important stage, but I think you're right in it's the stage that comes next, which is always the most interesting and the most difficult. Of sort of once we sort of have adopted some very simple behavioral type insights, then how do we harness behavioral insights further than that, right? Mm-hmm. Is that it, or what comes next? How do we innovate? So
I can just imagine you standing there, like, on the front line, and just the battle is being fought around you, behavioral science galore, and you're just there, like, is this it?
Yeah, I'm just like
completely lost in the middle of chaos.
Oh, that describes me so perfectly. Lost in the middle of chaos. Yeah, but
it would be a beautiful painting.
It would be, and maybe that's enough for now. A beautiful painting.
I suppose on that slightly creative note, we're gonna end this episode. Guys, of course, as always, everything about Christian, his newsletter, his podcast, his site, his soon-to-be book, I presume, like everything will be linked below. As always, do check him out. His podcast is just really, really great. I mean, as you could probably tell from this episode, the man has just got great fucking energy. He really does. He really breathes behavioral science. He really lives for it, and he makes compliance sound interesting. And I think if you can do that, you're a pretty fucking talented person. So really do check out his stuff. We hope you enjoyed this episode, and we hope that you will join us for the next one, as always, coming out next week. And have a great week, guys.
Thanks, guys.
You're the dummy that don't believe in science. All your projects always be denying. You're the one I love, you're the one I want.